So good afternoon and welcome to today's webcast titled The Impact of AI. We are glad you've joined us for this Chartered Banker Institute production. My name is Nicholas Boyle. I'm an academic associate at the Chartered Banker Institute and also a director of Storm 7 Coaching. And we're delighted to share our Leadership for All series. The way we position this is it's time to rethink what leadership means. Historically, the perception of leadership is that it only applies to a few individuals with seniority status within an organization. The role of said leader was to provide guidance and direction to the team. Many conversations have centered around leadership styles and how leaders can lead effectively. In our Leadership for All series, our range of podcasts, webcasts, and blogs, we explore how everyone can adopt key aspects of leadership within their roles daily without necessarily being a leader. We've already completed some of the series as is, and we had our first webinar a few weeks ago, which was around about ethical decision making. Today, obviously, we've got the impact of AI, and we'll follow this up in a few weeks with making sustainable choices, and then finally, vulnerable customers are the other two subjects we will move on to. We also have blogs and podcasts linked to each of these, and they're all available on the Chartered Banker Institute website. And you will also see them being messaged out on social media as well, so that we can get as many people having a look at these bits and pieces of information, podcasts and blogs, and also this webcast. So as I mentioned earlier, the topic for today is the impact of AI. Today's session will last just under an hour now, and during the live webcast, you may ask our panelists questions, and we welcome you to do so via the Q&A function. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, as I said, and will be available to view on demand shortly afterwards. And now I'm delighted to introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Laurie Aiken. Laurie is an ethics fellow in the public policy program at the Alan Turing Institute. Laurie's research examines social and ethical dimensions of innovation, particularly relating to AI and data science. And prior to joining the Turing Institute, Laurie was a senior research associate at Newcastle University, where she worked principally on a project exploring the role of machine learning in banking. Welcome, Laurie.
Thank you, Nick. Very pleased to be here today.
And our second guest today is Ross Laurie, who is the CEO of Visible Capital. So Ross began his career as a systems developer with Scottish Equitable in the 90s, I'll say. Got caught up in the dot-com bubble and went on to launch his own business using digital technologies to improve processes and create new markets. So now a tech entrepreneur who uses open banking and finance to further improve digital onboarding and ongoing suitability processes within the wealth sector. As a B2B product, Visible Capital provides advisors with the financial plumbing needed during intense fact finds filled with data, etc. So welcome, Ross.
Thanks, Nick. Good to be here as well.
Glad to have you both. It's fantastic, and I'm really looking forward to hearing everything that we will be discussing today. So to start off, we're going to start with a quick poll for everybody out there, which Emma's going to put up on the screen for us now. And it would be great if you could just spend a minute and answer the poll. So fairly simple. How would you describe your understanding of AI? Is it comprehensive, somewhat familiar, would like to learn more, or unfamiliar? It just gives us an idea of the knowledge levels on this, especially when we follow up with further collateral. Great. Okay, brilliant. So somewhat familiar, would like to learn more, seem to be the two biggest aspects. That's great. Well, I know that you are in the right place now. Fantastic. Great stuff. So basically what we'll be doing is we'll run through some questions and answers. As I said, at any time, pop in some questions that you have as an audience for the panelists, and we'll get to those a little bit later. And we'll ask those questions after we've had the discussion part of it. and we'll do that hopefully, between sort of 22 quarter to 2 for the last part of the session. So our questions, I guess I'm going to start with Vary first, and we're just going to ask a question of both the panels today, because I think it's an important one. But what impact will AI have on the banking industry over the next 10 years?
It's a big question. I think there's different ways to answer it. But I think certainly there's no doubt about it that AI is going to really transform the banking industry over the next 10 years. I mean, it's already transforming banking today. And that'll be in lots of different ways. So partly it's about creating new systems to more efficiently process, large volumes of data, to automate kind of mundane, repetitive tasks within banking. But there's also really interesting questions around what does it mean for how we will bank, as individuals. How will people interact with banks in 10 years time? And I think that's going to look really fundamentally different over the next 10 years, increasing banking through kind of virtual and digital means. Maybe in 10 years time we'll all be banking on the metaverse. It's not infeasible, but I think for me the big questions are around whether these innovations and whether increasing uses of AI in banking will that lead to reducing or exacerbating existing inequities within society? And I would hope that uses of AI help to kind of increase accessibility of financial services and accessibility in banking. But there are also concerns around whether increasing reliance on digital means might actually reduce accessibility for some groups, people who don't have reliable or consistent access to internet, or who don't have kind of confidence or don't feel comfortable to access banking through digital means. Those for me are really important questions, and questions that determine, I guess, the level of kind of optimism or pessimism about what this might do over the next 10 years.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. I think some really brilliant comments there, not only about the industry but also the customers. And yeah, I think that's a really good point about seeing some real growth in internet usage and people being able to get these kind of services, but still in some places around the world sporadic, not quite as we'd like it yet. So definitely there'll be, for everyone that's included, there'll be others that are partially excluded, I would imagine. Great, thank you. And Ross, same question for you. What impact will AI have on the banking industry over the next 10 years from your perspective?
Well, I agree with Vary. I mean, I think it's going to be all-encompassing, in as much as banks and financial services have always been quite big innovators. We talk about fintech now, but they're as you discussed at the start, I've been in technology and finance for a fair while now. So we've been doing it for a while. I think we're going to see more on the side of machine learning than the AI side of things. There's nuances between the two. Customer service is the one that's the sort of front end of it, where you can see benefits. There's even I saw last week on Reddit there was somebody's developing sign language interpreters for customer service. So that communication is just that little bit easier. So there's a lot of benefits on that front. My leanings are more on the sort of the B2B side of things, and the process efficiencies that we gain in the back office. Everything from tracking and responding to regulation, right the way through to actually getting a grip on all this data that we're beginning to gather. And actually, I don't think the movement of AI can happen without a better understanding and a better way to gather data. And of course, machine learning can help us with that. So I think it's going to be, I'm a glass sort of full person on this. I'm quite optimistic. I get dead excited with any new technologies. And I always see how they can help us rather than replace us. I think going forward, we're moving to a sort of hybrid, advice, financial services model. There's an awful lot more data to take into account. As Vary says, what will banking even look like in 10 years? We've already got, creeping into central bank digital currencies. You've got different asset stores that people have. And really, if you want to try and help people financially, you need to understand that full picture of their life. And that's difficult to do as a person, but you can get a computer to help.
Yeah, and there was, obviously a lot of people worried initially about open banking, about all the data, and I guess we'll come on to that as we go through the section. And there's some questions we've got specifically about the data. Pardon me. So just a quick one. Thanks for that, Ross. Really interesting overall perspective, and I think we'll dig into that as we go through the session. Vary, what do you see as the biggest customer attitudes or concerns about AI and how banks should address these kind of worries and fears that people have?
Yeah, I think that's really important. There's often quite a lot of speculation about what the public thinks or what the public might be worried about when it comes to AI, but actually there's not an awful lot of research that's really engaging with these questions and really kind of finding out what do people want and what are their concerns and what do they already understand or know about AI. As you said when you introduced me at the beginning, I previously worked at Newcastle University, where I was working on a project called FinTrust, and in that project with colleagues at Newcastle, we were looking at these questions around the extent to which members of the public might trust in uses of AI, uses of machine learning within the banking sector. And so in our research, we talked to people about AI in banking and asked them kind of how they felt about this and what the concerns might be or what their preferences or interests might be. And it was really interesting because most people that we spoke to had never thought about these issues before. They had no kind of prior understanding or I guess even prior interest in thinking about AI in banking, but they were really engaged in the discussions and we had really kind of nuanced discussions. You very rarely find people who are kind of outright opposed or outright, altogether supportive of everything. Most people have, particular kinds of concerns or conditions around whether or not they might use a service. What we found really clearly through that research was that the main things that mattered to people was the sense of being in control, so in control of their data, as well as in control of their finances. And if a new kind of AI-powered service or product gives them a sense of control over their data and a control over how they interact with that service, it's viewed positively. Whereas if it's seen as a way of kind of harvesting data, or they don't know kind of who then is using that data for what purposes, or they feel a kind of loss of control within that, then they're more likely to be opposed to that. And we also spoke to them about things like open banking. And again, that was a similar kind of thing that they, if they perceived that's giving them control over their finances, they viewed it positively. Whereas if they didn't feel in control of how data was being collected or processed, they viewed it negatively. And I think that's really important. The other big theme that came up there was around concern about potential deception. And we come across this a lot. People are interacting with AI, the need to feel that you know what was really going on here. So if you're interacting with a bot, for example, for giving advice or on customer service, if you know that it's an AI and you're making a decision to interact with an AI bot, that's okay. But if, as these bots become more and more human-like, there's a wariness or there's an uneasiness about, do we know if we feel that this might be or if we believe that we're interacting with a human and it turns out to be a bot, there's a sense of deception and concern around that. So I think it's really important to look further at kind of what people's concerns are and how we can ensure that those are addressed and taken on board as we roll out more AI-enabled services and as AI continues to play a bigger and bigger role in customer service and in the ways that customers interact with banks.
That's great, Barry. Actually, you've touched on a really important point that we brought up at the podcast when we did the podcast on AI, and that was about regulation. So we're not going to touch on that today, but we did touch on the podcast because it was about how different regulation for fintechs as opposed to banks, and actually how do you marry the two up when we're talking about data that's commonly used in both. And I think that's an important point that we did touch on in the podcast. So thank you. That was a really good reference to that for me. Yeah, and I totally agree. I think there's lots of worries and fears, and a lot of it is driven by lack of understanding, isn't it? So yeah, great stuff. Thank you for that. And Ross, what benefits do you see AI bringing? And you mentioned earlier, actually, the back office as being sort of an area that you focus on. So what benefits would you see, AI bringing to the back office as an example?
I mean, I suppose process efficiency is sort of fundamentally where I see the benefit being, and if you can bring efficiency of process, you can reduce costs, which you can then pass on to the customer, or make more profit. You can take your pick, but you'd hope to pass it on to the customer. Yeah, I think that's that. I mean, I can go into more detail on that, but that's probably where I see it all happening, and that can cover everything. I mean, I have a very sort of simple view on things, possibly having always worked in sort of software and coding, that actually everything we do, especially in the service world, is pretty much governed by a nested if statement. So if an event happens, then take this action. And a lot of that can be quite repetitive and actually and costly. So I think using machines to help process that can stop us as humans having to waste time doing repetitive jobs. But actually the insights and things, and we'll keep coming back to the data collection. You know, we again, anyone who's as old as me or has worked in sort of, you know, software will know the term garbage in, garbage out. And that's sort of where we're at, I feel, at the moment. There's so much data out there. Open banking's beginning, and open finance is beginning to sort of open up those channels. But as I said, it's not just where you keep your money that dictates what you do with your life. There's other things that are involved. And it's very hard for even just humans to gather all that data at the moment. So by bringing in machines, we can allow that data capture to be more complete and more accurate and quicker, which then the humans can then use to sort of make decisions on. And as I say, I think all those efficiencies, and we're constantly evolving. You know, a lot of the things that we do in banking haven't really changed over the last 20 years. We've just got new technologies to do them different and quicker. And as a result of that, it gives more time to free up resource to figure out, well, how do we help the customer? So I think I don't think it's going to be as big an impact as everyone makes out. You know, I think these things slowly creep in, you know, and then we kind of look back and go, oh, look, we've now got a machine doing that. Never even saw it happening. But I've created more options for my customer as a result of that. So
yeah, I mean, I think Ross, one of the key things that obviously we've seen the front end side of it. So we've seen the AI coming in. You know, the banks have got those in abundance, and they seem to work very well. They're learning all the time. And in the back office, we've seen all of it's kind of, for me, it's almost seemed like a bringing together of all the data that was maybe on different systems. You know, as banks have grown, they've adapted, they've brought in new companies into the fold. Some have got out, so that they've had to bring together all of that data. And that was obviously, I think, one of the biggest challenges on organizations, was to be able to gather all that they had. And the point you make about garbage in, garbage out, and be able to make it worthwhile and useful. Now, I think, you know, we're seeing, even with the advent of CRM systems and things like that, we're seeing much more data alignment. When you talk about the back office, do you mean more than that? Is there more things that can be done than just, you know, actually bringing the data that we have together and putting a CRM, you know, wrap around it that ties it all into one place?
Yeah, I mean, in that example, I mean, that's almost a sort of front end example of it, isn't it? I mean, if you think even just regulation you talked about there's constantly evolving regulation in banking, and actually it's quite costly to stay on top of that and see what's happening. You know, so first of all, you've got to assess, you know, a new COBS framework that's updated. So you've got to go and read through 300 pages and figure out what's changed. And then you've got to figure out, well, actually, what impact is that going to have on the business? And that can be everything from, you know, risk profiles of the business in terms of, you know, assets stored versus, like, you know, how you deploy things to customers, not just COBS, obviously. But, you know, there's lots of regulation that comes out, and it takes time to go through it. So even just by speeding that up, we can become more compliant. But I would suggest that at every point in the banking system, there will be some efficiencies that could be gained because of repetitive processes that could be, you know, by using machine learning in particular. But the front end of it is where we'll always sort of focus, isn't it? You know, so, you know, looking at, you know, robo advice and all these things that people talk about, artificial intelligence for financial services. I think we're moving more to that hybrid model of machines helping humans do their jobs better.
Yeah, and we'll touch on that a little bit later as well, because it's a really important point. And when we start to talk more about some of the points later on, you know, I'll be wanting us to reflect on, you know, what does that mean for people within the banks as well, because obviously a large population of the people listening to this will be from the banking environment. And I think these are important points. You know, we talk about advances in data and machine learning, but, you know, I don't want us to feel that that's just at the advent of staff. It's always, you know, a worry for them. It's something that is constantly developing and growing and offering different types of roles and experiences. So we'll touch on that a little bit later. Thanks, Ross. It's really, really valuable to understand both that front end piece that I consider back office and the back office piece that you consider back office, which is slightly different, which is great. So thank you. Vary, what can the banking sector learn from the ways in which AI has been deployed in other sectors?
Yeah, and again, I think that's really important. I mean, AI is, the pace of innovation around AI and the way that AI is being applied to more and more areas, that's not unique to banking. That is happening across all sectors. And so I think it is really important to learn from different sectors and learn from different experiences. Learn from mistakes as well as successes around what we need to take on board when we're innovating with new approaches and developing new techniques or deploying new techniques. And of course, AI is being deployed across all sectors. But I think that there are particular examples that we could draw on from health. And I'd say health because it's an area where, so we think of financial data as being particularly personal and sensitive, and perhaps the health is that kind of a comparable in terms of being another source of very sensitive and personal data. And these are two forms of data that people often have concerns around what might happen with this data and how it might be used. And so I think it's really valuable to look at what's happening across these sectors and look at what's happening in health. And there's a huge amount of innovation around the ways that AI is being developed and deployed in health contexts. Everything from developing new diagnostic tools and then being used in like telemedicine and virtual delivery of health services. And again, similar to financial context, that is in part speeding up processes. For example, in diagnoses, it's also increasing accessibility of health services by enabling kind of virtual means of health services. And so there's lots that we can look at there in terms of comparisons. But I think what's also really important to look at is that there have been quite a few kind of high-profile public controversies and public concerns around the ways that AI or new data systems have been developed and deployed within health contexts. And there's a lot that we can learn from that in terms of, or anticipate kind of what those concerns might look like. And in many cases, it's the key issue has been around kind of what are the benefits of these systems and to what extent do they benefit real patients. And in financial context, you might think, to what extent do these really benefit real customers on a day-to-day basis? And there are big issues around kind of trust and how we ensure trust in the ways that systems are developed and deployed. And that's really important within health context. A lot of the concerns that have often arisen because there's been a sense that patients or members of the public haven't been engaged in decision-making processes around how these systems are developed and deployed, or that public interest, patient interest haven't been taken on board in the development and deployment of systems. And so there have been instances where systems which are perfectly legally permissible, legally compliant, are met with significant opposition because they're not seen to reflect kind of patient needs or patient interests or kind of wider public interests. And that's definitely something that we need to take account of in the banking context, thinking about not just legal compliance or regulatory compliance, but actually, are we developing these systems in a way that kind of meets public expectations? And importantly, that's not just about customer uptake. It's not just about our customers using the service, but more widely, is this kind of publicly acceptable? And the people who are not using this service, what are the concerns or what are the kinds of potential impacts that might be for kind of wider societal or public impacts of those services? And I think finance banking is one of those areas which it has potentially huge impacts across society, not just for direct customers, but banking is so crucial to structures of our society that we need to think much more broadly than just customers, but to kind of public impacts, societal impacts.
Yeah, really, really love that point. I think, and one, again, when we did some of the work on ethical dilemmas and ethical decision making, within the banks, often we talk about these kind of decision making can be improved by using models of different types, Tucker's and Molyneux's, or all these different types of models. But most of them work from a bank perspective. But actually, you need to start using these type of things and question from a customer perspective and also a sector perspective. So I love those points. I think they're so valuable for us to remember in banks, that always to have that customer at heart in everything that we do. And also the bigger picture as well around about, the various, kind of global macroeconomic things that hit us, pandemics and climate and those things, when we were starting to use the kind of information and data we have. Ross, what do you see as the importance of data, and how is it vital to the intelligence part of banks?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, a good question, because that is, you're only going to get an intelligent answer if you've got an intelligent input, I suppose. Otherwise it's artificial stupidity. It is quite fundamental. That health example was a great example, actually, for a number of reasons. One, and this is a slightly different point, but there's the concept of the identity stores is important to this, because there's, as I said before, there's a lot of data that if you're looking to give customers good advice, you need to understand, and you can either ask them or you can find it out because they permission you access to the data they already store. So if in the future we have some sort of federated identity model or self-sovereign identity model where we own our own data and permission it, then actually there's a lot more that the insight that the AI or machine learning really can give us back on that basis. So and I suppose that I keep saying the data sets keep getting bigger. One of the reasons that we feel that, you hear the stories of Facebook and Google and Amazon being able to, know what we're going to do next, and it's because they've got all this data that we freely share with them. And we're sort of hampered a little bit in financial services because we don't have access to that. We've got, at best now, access to all their bank accounts through open banking. You've then got insurance products on top of that. You've got, pension products, retirement, other retirement savings. All of these things are important in that financial services world. And, I think people are expecting, maybe unreasonably so, but more from banks than just somewhere to store their cash at these days. And even from the, oh, sorry, hang on, I knew that would happen. Even from the point of view of, there's more to banking than just saving and lending. There's insurance products that banks offer now. I've seen some, well, I've worked on some examples myself with AI firms where we've looked at, well, how do we use that along with other technologies such as smart contracts tied up in the blockchain? As I say, based on this principle of everything's a nested if. So a good example would be you buy some new stuff for the house, TV, fridge, whatever it might be, you take a photo of it and you store that to your asset store. Unfortunately, there's been a flood. You come down the stair, take a photo of it, and AI and machine learning would be able to identify what was damaged in that picture, process it for you. We'd understand what the value of that product was because you saved it the day you bought it with your receipt. And from that, we can then quickly and easily resolve your problems. Now, that's not been built, but I'm just trying to paint a picture of when you bolt together a bunch of technologies, not just AI, then you can do some pretty impressive things, but you can't do any of it without that data. And we're hampered as humans at the moment. We're not quite there. AI isn't going to be able to work until anyone who's done any work with AI developers, when they test something out and it doesn't quite work, they'll always say, we just didn't have a big enough corpus of data. It's the calling card. So we need to go back and get more data. So we're not going to get it. We're getting there, but I feel we've got a long way to go. We've still got to open up an awful lot more connections within the financial services world to get a true picture and true insight and true intelligence.
Fantastic. Sometimes I sit here and think, where do they get all the data from? I mean, is it just about being able to access more open data, be able to access and link through to people's Facebook accounts or LinkedIn accounts? Is that the type of thing? LinkedIn with their Sainsbury's or Asda for their shopping and what they buy at the supermarkets? Is that all the type of different things they could wrap up together?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, but again, as Mary says, you've got to figure out, you've got to give the customer that sort of feel that they're in control of it. So this is why I feel that we've still got a little bit to go in terms of the data stores and the models for that. As I say, if I wouldn't feel comfortable sharing, I don't think anyone would feel comfortable sharing, their health data with their bank. Why would they? Well, actually, because it might indicate what type of insurance products would be more beneficial to you, or it might help them understand your risk profiles, or even their own risk profiles. Whether or not there's going to be income coming into that account for IFRS 9 purposes. Whatever it might be. So I think as long as the customer feels in control of that. If I had my own identity store and I could say, okay, I'm going to share X, Y, and Z with my bank because I know they're going to be able to use that information to give me better advice or banking, then I would probably do that. But at the moment, I don't feel in control of my data, really. Yeah,
really, really interesting topic. I think we could talk about that for hours, but I like that whole idea of that store of data that you can then allow people. I guess that's based on you having all the knowledge of what they'll do with it and how they'll use it. But I think that's a really, really valuable point. And yes, potentially we're not quite there yet. Hopefully it will develop in that way going forward. And so Ross, just carry on to the next question with you on this one, I think, because it kind of kind of sits with what we're talking about. How can the banks deploy kind of these big AI technologies at scale to ensure they remain relevant? And I mean, the banks remain relevant.
I think banks will remain relevant for some time. But I don't necessarily think it's a case of deploying at scale or, quickly, because you've got to sort of build up to things. It wasn't so long ago, a lot of the things that we do in the internet were seen as creepy. Been able to sort of, you looked at this, maybe you'd be interested in that. That freaked people out not so long ago, people even got freaked out when you could take £10 out your bank card without having to key in a PIN number. So you have to phase things in. And I do think that most of the benefits that we'll see will be in that back office where there's, it doesn't really impact on the customer in terms of their day-to-day interaction, but it makes much more efficiencies in that process that gets the customer information to them. So the other thing you've got, I suppose, to sort of take into account, and I think you sort of slightly mentioned it, is the sort of regulation, the compliance side of things. There's one thing having the technology to do things, but another thing having the compliance processes in place to allow it. And we saw a lot of those changes happen with COVID. Even things like digital document signatures, which were kind of a little bit tricky, but now they're sort of quite commonplace and growing. I think that's the approach to it. So start off. Look for the low-hanging fruit. Where can you use this technology to create efficiencies, do the least damage, and then as it starts getting more confidence in it, then it starts creeping in. I think you'll always have that sort of customer-driven angle, though, because the media loves that side of things. That the chat bots and all those things. So there's a sort of balance, but I genuinely think the bigger impact the customer won't really see.
Fair enough. And Barry, same question, same point to you about this deployment of technologies. Do you see it any differently, or are you aligned with Ross?
Yeah, and I think partly it's about needing to create safe spaces for experimentation. And I mean, the established banks are, perhaps they're not the most agile, or not the. So I think that there's a lot of exciting things that are happening through collaboration with fintechs, or kind of newer fintechs, which have more agility, which are able to take more risks and are more kind of fast-paced, innovative environments in which to kind of experiment with new technologies, and opportunities for collaboration, crossover between banks, more established banks and fintechs to experiment and develop new technologies is really important to enabling that to happen. But I think some of the points around how innovation progresses and what technologies kind of come to the market or are adopted, there are some points where we have to be kind of careful, because there are things like contactless payments, people found felt uneasy. Gradually it's become the norm, it's kind of become established, and it's sort of shifting tolerances, or shifting kind of expectations around what is sort of the norm, or what people feel comfortable to do. But then there are some things, such as Ross, you mentioned Facebook data and what Facebook are able to do, or what they're able to predict based on the amount of information they have about us. And I wouldn't say that is because people are comfortable with it, or that they trust Facebook, or they're happy with Facebook having those things. It's more a sort of perhaps an increasing complacency, or a sort of a sense of powerlessness, that if you want to access particular services or you want particular benefits, you tolerate these sorts of risks. And it was interesting, say, with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where at first it was kind of this outrage that this was shocking, kind of what had happened with this Facebook data and how it had been used, and people saying they would leave Facebook. But it didn't really happen, and quickly people went back, and there was a sort of sense that people were saying that, well, we never really trusted them anyway. We didn't really expect them. We knew they were doing dodgy things. We didn't know what, we didn't know how bad, but we didn't really expect them to be doing good things with our data. And so there's a kind of complacency around then allowing that data to continue to be collected and used. That's a really dangerous position to be in. And it's certainly not something that the same expectations are not in place for banks and financial data. And we definitely don't want to get to that point. And we want to make sure that the data practices that are important to underpin financial services and the new kinds of innovation that we develop and implement have a strong foundation of trust. And actually, rather than public trust, like a strong foundation of trustworthiness. Let's make sure that the banks and the innovation processes are trustworthy. And and that it's not built on that sense of kind of complacency or a sense that you have to, that we don't have choice or control about whether or not we allow our data to be processed to access services. That this should be based on real trust and acceptable, appropriate data practices.
Yes, it's an interesting one because the banks that I've worked with, and it's several over many years, but I do see a real advancement in the way they do things. And I think you quite rightly, mentioned fintechs. There's been a lot of development around about fintechs for a number of years now, and there's also been a lot of changes to the way banks work. And I think that's been something that not that they've struggled with, but I think that people have had to upskill themselves and develop skills in terms of doing things differently. So agile being a key point in terms of the agile methodology of working, linked to lean and things like that. I think they've developed those hugely, and from that perspective started to change the way that they interact with customers at earlier stages, change products quicker and launch them, and be prepared to fail fast and change and adapt. So I think that's been some real sort of developments, probably long overdue, but I definitely think banks have started to go down those routes, which is quite important. Just I guess on that topic then, how can staff and banks ensure they're ready for the current and future impacts of AI development? What are the types of things they can do?
Yeah, so obviously there's a lot of talk about potential impacts on workforces, and we often hear concerns about worries about AI leading to job losses or replacing jobs, and to a certain extent AI will increasingly automate particular task or particular functions of the job. So automating kind of routine processing of data, mundane repetitive tasks, and so that will replace certain functions in jobs. But I think some of the current jobs may no longer be relevant in the future of banking, but there will be different jobs. And I think the legitimate concerns around potential job losses and impacts on jobs within the banking sector, but there will be different jobs, and we need different kinds of skills and different kinds of capacities within the banking sector. Of course, there's the need for kind of technical skills for people who can program and develop new AI systems, but there's also a need for people who can scrutinize and interrogate those systems, who can review and continually check that the AI systems or use of algorithms in decision-making processes or profiling processes, to check the outcomes of them, to check that they are not exacerbating inequalities or producing irregular or unjust outcomes. That's going to be a really, really important role in the future. So we need people who really understand AI and understand how to interrogate it, how to scrutinize it, how to check that it is working appropriately. I think we're also going to really need people who are kind of the interface between AI systems and the public, between AI systems and customers. Transparency is really important. Being able to explain how AI has been used and what the impacts are, how that has informed decision-making or informed outcomes for customers will be really important. And so having people who are that kind of interface. Ross has already spoken about, AI working really well as supporting humans, supporting human decision making, and that's sort of the optimal. Like we hear a lot about concerns of AI replacing humans, but actually AI works best when it's a decision support tool, or it's something that aids in decision making processes, or that supports humans in those tasks. And that's really important to think about it in those ways, and to think about the role that humans play in at all stages in the AI lifecycle, but we're kind of reviewing it and interrogating it, and also communicating transparently how this is being used and what kinds of impacts it's having.
Fantastic, thanks, Barry. And Ross, same question to you around about, what can staff do in banks to ensure they're ready for those current and future impacts of AI development?
Yeah, I agreed with everything Barry said there. I think and even going back a little bit, the trust factor is quite important. I do wonder if we should develop assume no trust. I wonder if we're in a position where we assume everyone trusts banks, but maybe we don't. Whereas if we assumed everyone didn't, maybe we'd we'd build systems slightly differently. But I do think on that there is a need for, as Barry said as well, almost a sort of pre-audit and an understanding of what new jobs and opportunities will come out of this new data. The jobs that it will replace will be the things we don't like doing anyway. I mean, if I could get an AI to come along and save me having to read email every day, that would be marvelous, wouldn't it? I could get on and do things better during the day. So I kind of, as I say, embrace this because I think it's, I'm fundamentally lazy. I don't want to have to keep doing repetitive tasks. If a machine can do it, well, that's fantastic. It gives me more time to do my job properly. So I think, but I think looking further down the line, it always amazes me. I love looking in the tech jobs, current tech job of the year, highest paid, and every year it's something you just couldn't imagine. I remember when we went from nothing to iOS developers being the highest paid people in the industry in a 5-year period, and nobody even heard of iOS 5 years before. So I get excited about what we'll create. It doesn't have to be all tech. As I say, a lot of the tech will just enable humans to do what they were doing before better. So I think the advice I would give is don't fear it. Figure out what part of your job you don't like that the machine might replace, and then figure out how much of your time you're going to have to do better things with it. So I'm quite optimistic about it. Perhaps Panglossian, but I've not seen. I sort of joke that I've worked in technology all this time and I've never written any software to create a job. Yet banks and financial services companies haven't got smaller in the last 30 years. Yeah. So, I don't really, I think, if you're worried about keeping the job that you don't like, then yeah, be worried. But if you want to sort of, get on and sort of figure out how you can be better serving customers and do more exciting things during the day with in your job, then that's the way I look at it. But I'm very glass half full, and I understand that.
Yeah, no, look, I think that's absolutely some good points there, and something that we all need to consider when working in banks and in the industry. We have seen so much change, with the pandemic and everything else that's gone along with it. And that's meant that banks have struggled with things like culture internally because of, new people. I speak to graduates every now and again as well, and some of them haven't met some of their colleagues yet. And, it's just crazy. Some people haven't seen some for others. And I know a lot of the banks are going down a kind of a route of who needs to work from home for the longest, or who's most important to be in the office and things like that. So I think as time goes on, it's about retaining as many of our staff as we can, but retraining to continue the culture without, obviously we still need to bring in new people and refresh the group and bring in, people that maybe have those new tech standards and education standards moving forward to keep developing. But certainly I think there's a great opportunity for banks to upskill people, for people to upskill themselves, and for us to retain some of the fantastic people within banking, but just maybe doing different jobs. And I think that's a key part. Brilliant. So just I'm probably going to just have a quick pause there for a second and move into a couple of questions, because we do have a couple of questions that have come in from the audience, and that's great. I really appreciate that. And if you do have any questions that you would like to ask but haven't quite typed them up yet, please go ahead and we'll try and get to them all throughout the session. So the first one comes in, this is anonymous at this stage, which is fine. The question is, will AI help support leaders with emotional intelligence needs? Emotional intelligence needs, and are there technologies like this already? Any thoughts on that, Ross?
Hang on, I'm just I've accidentally brought sorry, I brought the questions up and I couldn't get the screen back. Sorry. Sorry, Nick, could you repeat that? I got distracted.
Will AI help support leaders with emotional intelligence needs, and are there technologies like this already?
I don't know if there's technologies like that already. The emotional intelligence side of things, I mean, it's a good question. The challenges, and you touched on it there with, since we've been working at home and remotely, I've not met some of our team, it's incredible. And I do think that, I suppose as a business leader, I do spend an awful lot of time on sort of one-to-one Zoom calls with people individually. And I feel that I know less about the team as a result of not being with them. So I really don't know what the answer to it is. I don't know if there's software out there that helps with it already, but certainly you still need human contact. I'm not sure how that would work, other than gathering data on your staff, which sounds creepy, doesn't it?
Well, I think you're so one of the, actually this kind of fits in with my wheelhouse quite well, because I'm a practitioner in emotional intelligence amongst the coaching work that I do as well. And what I would say to that is that yeah, we need to get more data on people's emotional intelligence, and that's to help them develop. And if we use it as a leadership tool, now we know that leaders with emotional intelligence and a developing emotional intelligence is a learnable skill, will perform better. They'll understand their staff better, they'll understand the customer better, and they'll be able to work, better with them. Now, there are also good uses of emotional intelligence, like for instance, in the recruitment process. If we could automate something around that to understand, the emotional intelligence requirements for a role and be able to sort of match people to that much more effectively. And I think that's something that can assist in terms of data. So performance and recruitment, and there's different areas like that I think are key from an emotional intelligence perspective. But definitely, I think the key starting point for me is getting banks to work more with understanding the leadership emotional intelligence and how we can improve that. Yeah, and that's something if anyone has any questions about, you can send to me offline and we can take forward.
Recruitment is a good call, because you are looking for people that sort of fit, who have got a skill set but fit with the existing team. I still think you'd want to at least chat to them, though, wouldn't you? Maybe whittle down a list. But then I don't think I'm particularly good at writing about myself, so would I even get onto that list in the first place?
Well, I think we've all seen the parts where you've got to use specific wording in a specific way in a specific place to be able to even get onto a list. And yeah, that's the type of thing. Whereas emotional intelligence is different. If you harness that within your own staff, as an example, and you know that you need somebody for a specific role for a team that's maybe been under supported in the past, or a new team that needs to really fly quickly, then you can start to get the skills from your data on your individual people. That's how I would say it. I've got a question for Vary here as well. Vary, what is your findings on people's perceptions of AI based on the great work you do for the Turing Institute?
Yeah, so we're so a lot of what I do at the Turing Institute is I work in a public policy program. So the work that we do is looking at uses of AI in the public sector, and particularly kind of in relation to public sector areas and in government. And so our work is looking at kind of how we can develop and ensure ethical approaches to the ways that AI is used in the public sector. And in part looking at kind of public expectations and impacts on the public around the ways that AI is used. We're about to embark on a piece of work looking at children and young people's views on AI, particularly in the public sector. And I think that's going to be a really exciting piece of work. This isn't relating to banking, but it's relating to perceptions of AI. And I'm really excited to do this piece of work looking at children and young people's views, because I think that that's so far been largely overlooked in discussions around AI and indeed discussions around technology more broadly. And it's really important, because to develop ethical approaches to innovation or ethical AI, to me, what ethical AI means is AI that aligns with public expectations and kind of societal values of what innovation should deliver for society. And we can only do that by engaging in conversations with the public, identifying what those values, what those expectations are, and seeking to reflect and address those in practice. So I think that's really important. I did want to say something about the emotional intelligence aspect from a slightly different perspective, but there's interest in uses of AI, in emotion recognition, and whether AI can understand emotions, or with the idea that it would have emotional intelligence. I mean, artificial intelligence doesn't have intelligence; it has the appearance of intelligence, or could be seen to be intelligent. And I don't think AI could ever have emotional intelligence. But there is a lot of work developing AI systems which are with the aim of recognizing emotions. And that could be relevant to banking in customer services, or in bots, in in bots that interact with customers and customer services. And there have been studies to look at whether a bot could recognize the emotions of customers and respond appropriately, to give appropriate advice, or to identify risk, or respond appropriately to a customer based on emotion recognition. We also see that in the insurance industry, in voice monitoring, recognizing tone of voice to attempt to identify dishonesty or honesty in a person's voice. I think this is an area of significant concern, and there are significant limitations around these technologies and how they're developed and deployed, particularly if we're looking at, say, facial recognition technologies to identify emotional responses. The data that this is trained on, or the assumptions that go into those models and how they're trained, are really important. For example, do they take account of different cultural backgrounds, cultural norms? Do they take account of, say, neurodiversity, and how people, neurodiversity might have different ways of interacting, or might express or display emotions differently in different contexts? And so there is interest in developing technology which is attempting to recognize emotions and to respond to customers in relation to those emotions. But I think currently that technology is quite questionable as to whether it can really do that. And there are real concerns about the potential impacts on customers, whether it is fully taking account of their needs and different ways of communicating emotions in different contexts.
Yeah, really early days on that. And I have also heard, similar things where the bot, the AI, responds to tonality in a voice, and then was able to amend its approach to the next question. So really, really interesting stuff when you get into that. And I think something that will be with us at some point in the future, that's being developed currently now. Quick, and I'm going to ask these last couple of questions, and then we'll need to finish up. But we did have one question for everybody there. So, how would metaverse influence banking? And Vary, you mentioned this earlier, so I'm going to come straight back to you. This is a great question from Abdul Rahman Sheikh, and thank you for that.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this. I think obviously there's such excitement and skepticism about the metaverse currently, about what this might deliver, what it might do. And so we've already seen, I think it was JP Morgan the other week announced that they had a kind of a virtual sort of branch that you could go into on the metaverse. I think we're definitely going to see innovation in using things like the metaverse for banking. But we're not there yet. And whether people feel comfortable with sensitive transactions, financial transactions, most people probably not. Probably went a long time before people feel comfortable there. I think potentially there's the opposite impact, where as we're coming out of this, or we're coming kind of through this period of doing more and more online, that actually the importance of human interaction and the importance of physical face-to-face interaction and accessing the services is kind of being revalued. And I do wonder, as things move increasingly onto the metaverse, if we're going to start to have more conversations around for banking, what is a bank? What is the bank's role in our society and in our communities? And do we want it just to be a thing that we interact with purely through virtual digital means? I think probably not. And perhaps this will actually spur a re-engagement with banking as something physically within our communities that we interact with. And the more that we do things online, there is also a kind of feeling of wanting to do more things face-to-face and having more kind of human interaction and human connection. So I kind of think it could go either way. And actually interactions with the metaverse might lead to some people wanting to do things more offline, like revaluing what we do offline.
Yeah, fantastic. Really, really interesting subject. We'd probably do a webinar on that one alone. So really, thank you.
I'd love to be in the room when Nick Clegg, the FCA, and the Bank of England are all discussing banking on the meta. I mean, that'd just be awesome. I just, there's so many hurdles there that. Yeah, good luck with that.
Final question for yourself, Ross, which Tim Evans has asked, and it's talking about obviously ISO 2022 promises to make bank statement and transaction data richer with a greater amount of useful metadata. Do you see there being a sweet spot between the ISO requirements and AI?
Well, first up, I'm not an expert on 22022. But I do understand that it is about getting more data, more uniformity in the data and the data that's available. So I mean, it goes back to my point: the more data we've got, the more insight we can get. Metadata in general has been of interest to anyone in software because it does give you those insights. The challenge we still have is getting from all that big data to small insights, though, and that's again where I think the ML piece of it can come in. It's one thing having all this, but it doesn't mean anything if you can't understand what it means. So yeah, I'm not an expert on that specific legislation, but or standard, sorry. But again, more data and it's actually all. I feel this is all aiming in the right direction of regulators coming along and going, okay, we accept we're getting more and more into this world. How do we make sure that we've got compliance in place and standards to make sure that people don't get done over?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for that. And I think some really good points there. I think you're absolutely right about regulatory involvement. I think it's a must. I think it's important as long as it doesn't slow anything down. But I think we need to, because of the worries about data generally from the public, from the customers, and making sure that we use them as effectively as we can. So I'm going to bring us to a close there. So first of all, yeah, just a huge thanks to Vary Aiken, Ross, Laurie. You've both been absolutely fantastic, really thought-provoking stuff. I loved your insights onto this, and I'm sure the audience have really enjoyed hearing from you as well. So thank you so much.
Thanks. You.
And to our fantastic audience, thank you. Some brilliant questions at the end there. Really loved those. I think there was one about which we are going to answer separately around about qualifications in this kind of field, which we'll get to. So thank you for putting that in. We'll come back to you afterwards on that. If there are any other questions, please don't hesitate to get involved, to get in touch with us, and we can make sure that we answer those for you. But apart from that, I'd just like to say thank you to everybody involved, to Emma behind the scenes for running the show for us, as I mentioned, to Vary and Ross, and also to you all for joining us today, and to those listening afterwards on the recording on YouTube, thank you as well. Really appreciate you taking your time to spend with us on this series, and look forward to catching up with you at the next webinar. Thank you.